Hello everyone and welcome back to Creation Myths. Today we are going to watch this video on bacterial evolution from Long Story Short. And if you know Long Story Short, the short form video creator affiliated with Discovery Institute, you can probably guess how bad this is going to be. But let me tell you, it's worse than that. Now, I've covered a long story short video before, the one on junk DNA, and that led directly to my debate with Dr. Casey Luskin and a months-long kerfuffle with Discovery Institute. Now, this video is a little older. It's from back in 2020, but it covers some topics that you see creationists talk about a lot. So it's a really useful vehicle to be able to talk about the refutations to the usual creationist lies about these topics. So let's get right into it. I'm going to alternate between showing short clips and talking about those clips. I'm going to cut things here and there, but we're going to end up watching most of this 12.5-minute video. So let's do it.
When antibiotics are misused, it can lead to them suddenly not working anymore. And if you ask folks like Richard Dawkins and Bill Nye the Science Guy, the answer is that this is incontrovertible proof of evolution right before our very eyes. It's an evolutionary arms race, they say. As our weapons of medical warfare get stronger and more sophisticated, so too the bugs we're fighting are getting stronger. They're evolving better defenses, making them immune to the best we can throw at them. The power of natural selection and random mutation laughs at our incompetent medical prowess. Bacterial evolution and antibiotic resistance is one of the all-time greatest hits regarding evidence for evolution.
My first thought, right away, wrong. Literally that, the word wrong in big red letters in my head. It's definitely a great illustration of evolution, but evidence? You can look at any population, sequence the DNA over generations, and find evidence for evolution. Oh, but of course creationists mean macroevolution, something that they don't really want to define, but big picture evolution kind of stuff. Oftentimes creationists mean something like universal common ancestry, when the real definition of macroevolution is just speciation or broader in terms of the changes that occur. So antibiotic resistance, of course, isn't at the top of that list. Instead, you're going to want to look at things like the nested hierarchical pattern of similarity across all cellular life, directly observe speciation events, and directly observe instances of new complex traits like multicellularity evolving. Those are your go-to directly observable evidence for large-scale evolutionary change.
And it's true that antibiotics do sometimes stop working. And antibiotic resistance is a form of evolution, narrowly speaking.
It's evolution. That's literally the definition of evolution. Creationists always either directly dispute this or downplay it because they all know if you go along with this, there really isn't any barrier to larger scale changes. So they have to present it as somehow not counting, right? Like this isn't good enough. This is just fill in the blank with whatever creationist phrase you want to use, but it's not evolution, right? But that's nonsense. This is evolution.
But is this a demonstration of the creative power of Darwinian evolution, or is there something else going on?
There it is, Darwinian evolution. Mark your bingo card and or drink responsibly if you're playing along. It's 2025. Not 1859, we don't do Darwinian evolution anymore. Discovery Institute knows this, Long Story Short knows this, creationists know this, they're just playing word games, they're not being honest when they play this card.
There's a lot of ways for antibiotics to defeat bacteria. Some explode it, some gum up the works, some starve the little bugs out, others prevent them from multiplying, and so on.
That was all basically fine, and we can go to the next segment.
But there's essentially only one or two ways that bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics. The first and most common way bacteria gain resistance is that it's always been there. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria actually pre-exist the invention of modern antibiotics. There's an interesting story of some Arctic explorers from back in the 1800s. Turns out they froze to death before the discovery and use of antibiotics. Some morbid scientists found them recently and took samples of their gut bacteria and found that they already had resistance to some of our most powerful modern antibiotics. Just like some people are naturally short and immune to limbo bars, Some bacteria naturally have a pre-existing resistance to antibiotics. Not because they've gained this ability after an encounter with the antibiotic, but it's just always been the case.
And we go from basically fine to wrong. It doesn't seem like the writer and editor or editors of this video know that antibiotics are naturally occurring chemical compounds and resistance is part of a natural arms race. We, humans, didn't invent antibiotics. We discovered them. Bacteria didn't evolve resistance in response to our clinical use. Antibiotic resistance predates the 20th century. It evolved as part of the naturally occurring arms race among things like microbes and fungi in the environment. Our use and our overuse of antibiotics just imposes a really strong directional selective pressure for more widespread and more effective resistance. Also, let's point out here that he said, and this is a direct quote, there is essentially only one or two ways bacteria become resistant. Now first, the word essentially is a classic weasel word. Anytime you hear that from a creationist, you should be skeptical of whatever comes next. But more directly, I hear that and think there are one or two mechanisms of resistance. That's what I think that means, since this section is in contrast to all the different antibiotic mechanisms described a minute ago. But then the first item is not a mechanism, it's just describing that resistance predates human use of antibiotics, which is true because antibiotics predate human use of antibiotics. So right away, there's a lot of trickery going on here. There's a lot of either inaccurate or dishonest presentation of these dynamics.
That said, bacteria do have a neat special ability that short people don't have. They love to share. Not just cooking recipes and financial advice, but super personal things like their very own DNA. They'll swap loops of DNA called plasmids in a process called horizontal gene transfer, or HGT. Like third graders with Pokemon cards, they have no idea how they got them or even what they do, but they'll trade them back and forth, and occasionally, they'll share these resistance genes. Nothing new has been made or evolved though. Bacteria already had the ability to trade plasmids, and the genes for resistance already existed before antibiotics.
Okay, wrong. Wrong. I cannot express how wrong this is. This is completely ignorant of how these systems work. Again, antibiotics are naturally occurring. Resistance does not predate antibiotics. Resistance predates human use, clinical use of antibiotics. Those two statements are not the same thing.
This is hardly an arms race, and it's not a demonstration of Darwinian creative power, since there's no new mutations and no new genes that have been made.
Wrong again. That segment was less than 10 seconds long, and immediately wrong again. I don't know if the people who wrote this script just have no idea what they're talking about, or if they're lying in like every sentence. But long story short is affiliated with Discovery Institute, so my baseline assumption at this point is that they're lying through their teeth. So let's break this down. The quote I want to start with is, "Not a demonstration of Darwinian creative power." That is a very specific choice of words. As everyone with a passing understanding of evolutionary biology knows, natural selection doesn't create, which is to say it doesn't generate new variants. It picks from among existing variation. That's been the case since Darwin in terms of our understanding of how natural selection works. So the phrase Darwinian creative powers is nonsense. That doesn't make sense in the context of what we understand about evolution, nor in the context of what Darwin understood about evolution. And for a professional creationist, which is what I'm going to consider LSS, given their affiliation with Discovery Institute, that makes this argument a dishonest representation. Now, we can keep going here because that's not the only problem. No new mutations. Wrong. We've directly documented the novel mutations involved in antibiotic resistance experimentally, including more than one instance of finding new mutations in the lab that had never been seen in nature. And in at least one case with those experiments, the resistance mutations later appeared clinically. But we don't even have to stop there with this segment, They also said no new genes that have been made. This is a very typical creationist play. If there aren't new genes, it's not really evolution, or something like that. This ignores that most evolution, even evolution of complex novel traits, doesn't require new genes. And again, this is something we've directly documented. Even things like new limb structures, feathers, complex morphological features have been directly shown to only require changes to the expression pattern of existing genes. And resistance is way less complex than those traits, so we shouldn't expect it to require new genes. Of course, you can get resistance without new genes. That is obvious. It's been directly documented experimentally. Do you see how silly it is to use that simple statement of fact as an argument against evolution? It's basically saying it's easy to evolve this new trait, therefore evolution's stupid. Creationists, do you hear yourselves? You're saying the ease of evolution, the fact that we don't need a bunch of new genes for it to happen, is an argument against evolution. That's an argument for evolution. Turns out it's easier than you think it should be. That means it can happen more readily. I don't know what's complicated about this.
Not only that, but these extra resistance genes are frequently a net negative on fitness. Bacteria with extra useless genes tend to be less fit than regular old vanilla bugs.
This section doesn't make sense to me. It's contradictory. I thought they didn't have new genes, but now they do. They have extra useless genes, which confer resistance, which is useless? I don't know. It makes bacteria worse. All I'm pointing out here, because I can't extract something coherent from that, I'm just going to point out the lack of consistency and the internal contradiction in the arguments that we're hearing.
Imagine you're in a foot race. You usually don't need a duffel bag filled with camping supplies, a pickaxe, spare bowling balls, and a weed whacker during your typical foot race. If you do, great. Otherwise, it's a huge waste of energy lugging all of that stuff around, and it makes you less competitive. Bacteria with extra genetic load tend to be less fit than regular old vanilla bugs.
This is a great example of creationists making up their own definitions for words. That, what we just heard, is not what genetic load means. Genetic load does not mean having more genes or a larger genome. It means having more harmful mutations in your genome. So here we have creationists conflating terms that they know are not the same. They 100% know, but they're going to make the argument anyway.
What about mutations, though?
This is the second less common, but more interesting way that bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics. How does it work? Scientists are aware of pre-existing resistance. So to exclude it as a possibility in experiments, they can start with a single normal, non-resistant bacteria and let that multiply over and over again, and eventually the bacteria population can still develop resistance on its own. Here's how. When copying their DNA, organisms are pretty accurate and mutations are relatively rare, but given enough time, errors do sneak in, like typos or autocorrect when you're texting someone. Sometimes they're no big deal and you can get along in spite of them. But sometimes these mutations really do something and can confer resistance or even immunity to antibiotics. Amazing, that must demonstrate the mighty power of evolution. Well, hold your horses. It's sort of like someone who has no arms saying that they're immune to handcuffs. No legs? You're immune to toenail fungus. No teeth? Congratulations, you're immune to cavities. Think of how much you'll save on toothpaste and floss expenses. Deaf and blind? You're immune to getting annoying songs stuck in your head. Wow. This poor soul might technically be immune to those things in a perverse way, but it comes at a cost. He's hardly a more fit organism.
Okay, first, not all forms of resistance are reductions in function. Some are, others are not. So for example, you can, if you have an antibiotic that targets a specific enzyme, you can cut that enzyme out of whatever biochemical pathway it's involved in, and you can use a workaround. You can stop expressing a target receptor on the surface of a cell. Or you can do something different. You can use an enzyme to inactivate or break down the antibiotic. That's not a loss of function. You can use a pump to eject the antibiotic from the cell. That's not a loss of function. Neither of those mechanisms are being described here, despite efflux pumps being one of the most common forms of antibiotic resistance. And we've documented the evolution of these mechanisms experimentally. One example is one of the experiments I mentioned a few minutes ago, where they evolved a new form of resistance in the lab and documented the mutational pathway to it, the stepwise path to get the 5 mutations to get the really strong form of the resistance. That was an enzyme getting better at dealing with the antibiotic, not a loss of function. And also, right at the end there, with this is hardly a more fit organism, that's an example of creationists playing games with the definition of fitness. We see this all the time for things like genetic entropy, for example. John Sanford does this, Sal Cordova does this. Anyone that talks about genetic entropy basically has to invent their own definition of fitness. And that's what's going on here. It's definitionally more fit if it survives and reproduces better than the non-resistant bacteria in the environment with antibiotics, right? Those resistant bacteria are just, by the textbook definition of fitness, more fit. But creationists, like those at Discovery Institute and the aforementioned John Sanford, writing about the fake concept of genetic entropy, want to redefine fitness to be more akin to something like biological complexity. That's not what fitness is, and any creationist argument that relies on that redefinition can be ignored for that reason alone. So this is a great place. If you're having any conversation with a creationist and they bring up the concept of fitness, stop what you're doing and make them define it. And if they give you the wrong definition or refuse to define it in a precise way, that's the ball game. That's it. You can just end it right there because they're not on the level. They are not engaging honestly with whatever it is you're talking about.
And these mutated bacteria are just hobbled, busted up versions of the original.
Again, wrong. This is being presented as tossing off tons of systems, when in reality, if resistance involves losing certain things, it's one receptor, it's one enzyme, and many forms of resistance don't involve that at all. This is just a dishonest representation of the biochemical mechanisms of antibiotic resistance.
Darwinian evolution can't get very far by breaking things. Eventually, it'll run out of things to break. And in reality, when antibiotics are removed from the environment, these superbugs just sort of die out, because without the help of the antibiotics keeping the stronger, normal bacteria at bay, they can't compete and they die out. Those are the 2 ways that bacteria can resist antibiotics.
Completely false. Just there's no other way to say this. That was completely false. Once it appears, resistance almost never goes away. This is due to a mechanism called compensatory mutations, mutations that compensate for the cost of resistance if there is a cost. Once you have the compensatory mutation, the resistance isn't going anywhere. And the reason for this is that the double mutant that has both the resistance mutation and the compensatory mutation, you can see that on the right in this figure right here, that's the rightmost peak, is the double mutant. If you lose either of those mutations, you have to go through a fitness valley to get back to the wild type genotype, which is what's shown on the left, right? There's a word for this. It's called the lobster trap model of resistance, because like a lobster trap, once the bacteria go in, they get stuck and they can't come back out. I cannot express how dishonest it is to say that resistant strains die out once the antibiotic is removed. That is the opposite of what actually happens. That is one of the biggest problems we're facing in terms of our ability to continue to use antibiotics clinically. It's because once you have resistance to a singular antibiotic or a combination of antibiotic, those resistant bacteria, they don't just die off. That resistance sticks around. Now, usually, creationists are more subtle than what we see right here, but this is just straight up 2 + 2 = 5. I cannot convey my shock when I saw this part of the video the first time. It's like literally when I do my class, I teach evolutionary biology, and when I do antibiotic resistance in class, we spend a lot of time on this, and there's lots of graphs showing how the resistance doesn't go away, like this one, which is one of my favorites that I use in class, because this one shows the levels of antibiotic resistance among different bacteria in a hospital where the particular antibiotics in question have never been used. It's a direct refutation of what we just heard. It's ridiculous that someone who like should know what they're talking about, who's working with a professional creationist organization who presumably is having people like edit these scripts and look them over before they go out into the world. It's ridiculous that they're saying something as easy to refute and as just directly wrong as this.
Okay, forget about antibiotics. Let's look at the experiment that Darwinists always point to show evolution right before our very eyes. The granddaddy of bacterial lab work, Richard Linsky's long-term evolution experiment. In this famous experiment, Linsky has simulated in the lab, over the course of a few decades, more than 1 million years of evolution with bacteria. Since humans and other large organisms can take years or even decades to reproduce, it's difficult to see any change between generations happening in our lifetimes. But smaller microorganisms like the bacteria E. coli can reproduce in just minutes, letting us observe tens of thousands of generations and the changes that go along with that in real time. This is what Linsky has done for the past quarter of a century or so. Just let a bunch of E. coli bacteria reproduce and watched what happened. Pretty soon after the experiment began, he noticed that they started to grow much faster than normal. Then, a while later, Linsky's E. coli suddenly gained a new ability to eat something new called citrate. This was an earth-shattering find in the world of evolutionary biology. Scientists were swooning in the streets. To hear them tell the story, this was a huge new evolutionary leap, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt the power of random mutation in natural selection. But would you believe it if I told you there was a problem with this explanation as evidence for the creative power of evolution?
Oh goody, now we're going to get lies about the long-term evolution experiment, the Linsky long-term evolution experiment, where they've been evolving 12 populations of E. coli in the lab for decades. It's been going since the 1980s. Now, I'm going to do this, the thing I'm about to say, I'm going to do this without even watching the next segment, and we're all going to see how I do. You're all just going to have to trust me that I wrote this part of my outline before watching the rest of the video, but I'm on the up and up here. So here's what I think we're going to get in this part of the video. First, we're going to hear that the bacteria got more fit, but it's because their genome shrunk and they lost functions, not through evolving any new stuff, any new genes, anything like that. And then if we talk about the aerobic citrate line, the CIT plus line in that experiment, we're going to hear that they only evolved the ability to use the new food source through a loss of regulation. Something like, oh, they broke the switch and they couldn't turn the genes off. They could already use citrate. There's nothing new here. They just broke the ability. They lost the ability to regulate that gene. I bet we're going to hear that if we hear about the CIT plus line. And then we might even get something like, and plus, this can't demonstrate macroevolution because they're still just bacteria. And I forget when the papers related to the actual fitness and mortality rates in several of the lines of that experiment came out. Those papers may have come out after this video, but if they do talk about them, we're going to see claims about how those strains of bacteria are actually dying off. But that's wrong. I'll just do this preemptively, whether it's in there or not, that if they talk about how the CIT plus lines are experiencing a die-off, they only actually died off when they were only given citrate as food. But the ones that are in the ancestral environment, which is glucose and citrate, they're doing just fine. So let's see how I did with my predictions about the arguments that we're going to hear.
No? Good, because that would be untrue. There are at least 3 problems with this explanation. What exactly happened to cause the E. coli to grow so much faster? Well, they broke their flagella. What is that, and why would it make them grow faster? The flagella is a little outboard motor of the bacteria. It helps them move around and do their thing. But Linsky's bugs were in flasks that were swished around constantly, allowing them to get nutrients without ever having to move. They were spoon-fed lazy bums. This usually vital part was not currently needed, so it was a waste of energy, and they got rid of it. It's like selling the wheels off your car when you're at a stoplight. You'll save a lot of gas that way, sure, but you haven't really made a better car, and it'll sort of be a problem the next time you need to go anywhere.
Okay, 1 for 1. Yes, they lost functions and experienced genome reduction. That's what evolution predicts, and that's what happened, because these bacteria experience directional selection in a consistent environment with only one food source for many generations. They didn't have to move in that environment. They didn't have to eat other sources of carbon in that environment. So not spending energy on motility, for example, as mentioned here, was adaptive. Again, this is a creationist describing evolution as though it's an argument against evolution, something I will never understand. This is literally describing things that happened that we would expect to happen as though it's a problem.
Well, what about the citrate thing? It's gotta be obviously true that being able to eat a brand new substance is a good thing for these little fellas. Like if we could eat dirt or something. Imagine the possibilities. Well, to make a long story short, all of the complex genetic pathways and proteins needed to transport and metabolize citrate were there all along. Not only that, but E. coli also already had a sophisticated mechanism to turn this ability on and off depending on its environment, so that they could prioritize their optimum food source, glucose, and not waste energy. All that happened was that the sophisticated control mechanism, the switch, broke.
Called it. 2 for 2. I'll let it play a bit more and then we can talk about why this is a lie, but I totally called it.
This bacteria lost the ability to turn off an ability that they already had. Now it was stuck always on, wasting energy to try and transport and metabolize citrate even when it wasn't necessary.
I don't know how many times I've said this already, but wrong. That's just factually wrong. Here's what actually happened in this situation. The required gene called CYT was duplicated into a nearby region of the genome. That new site was controlled by a different promoter, the on-off switch for the gene. Now, the original promoter was only active in the absence of oxygen, so you could only use citrate as a food source in an anaerobic environment. The promoter at the new location could be active with oxygen present. They could still turn it off. You could now express the second copy of the gene with oxygen present. So you have one copy, then you have another copy. The switches, the on-off switches, are different. That's it. Creationists always describe this as a loss of regulation, and that's wrong. All promoters are regulated, and this new trait didn't involve breaking the original promoter. It was a duplication of the gene into a new region under control of a different promoter. The old regulation still worked on the original copy. The new copy just had a different regulatory scheme because it was being directed by a different promoter. The best part of this is that one of the most detailed papers on this, which is this paper, and I'll link this below, was co-authored by a Discovery Institute guy. That's Scott, I think it's Minnick, I think I say his name. That's Scott Minnick right there. He's a Discovery Institute guy. So they have no excuse to be getting this wrong. If you want more on this, I've covered it in detail in this video. That is linked down below. Now in this section right here, I'm cutting out the next kind of chunk of the video. It's an obnoxious analogy with an alarm clock, and I'm just going to spare everyone having to listen to the obnoxious analogy with an alarm clock.
E. coli could already do a thing, and they were broken so that they did that thing constantly, whether they needed it or not.
What am I supposed to say here? That's wrong. 2 + 2 = 5. The sky isn't blue, it's triangle. I again have a hard time conveying the degree to which what is being said in this video is the opposite of reality. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Maybe you call that evolution, but Darwinian evolution demands innumerable new genes, new proteins, new body plans, new organs, and complex characters that we see in nature. This is not that. It's equivocation, using language so ambiguously that it misleads. For example, Aristotle was Greek. Greek is a delicious kind of food. Aristotle must have been delicious. Evolution has so many definitions that it's sometimes difficult to pin down what is meant by it. One could mean a shift in pre-existing populations, like Darwin's finches or peppered moths, or breeding or cultivation, like dogs or plants. But these are miles apart from extrapolating random mutation and natural selection can build new organs or body plans. Or universal common ancestry, zucchini are related to tuna fish, which is even further apart from the wild claim that it all happened strictly through materialistic processes. Darwinists equivocate when evidence is presented to prove one definition of evolution, where there is evidence and everybody agrees, and then another definition is quietly swapped in based on wild extrapolations to hoodwink people who aren't paying close enough attention.
I just wanted to show this part to point out the absolute shamelessness on display. Everything said here, equivocation, Mott and Bailey fallacy, poisoning the well with Darwinists, right, the creationist scare word. I've also mentioned that Long Story Short is affiliated with Discovery Institute, but this is just straight up creationist stuff, like the laziest nonsense, disputing common ancestry with Kent Hovind level language. It's literally the same language that Kent Hovind uses. What are we doing here, folks? This is something that I've come to realize over many years of dealing with creationists, is that at the end of the day, the professionals really aren't that much better than Kent Hovind, and that's really sad for creationists.
To extrapolate from antibiotic resistance to the larger kinds of changes evolution would need to make new animals is kind of like saying, last week, this cow could jump 1 foot high. This week, she can jump 2 feet high. Doubling at that rate in just 30 more weeks, she'll be able to jump clear over the moon. It's a bad extrapolation. There's a hard limit to how high cows can jump. And there's a hard limit to the time and populations available to evolution, and to the number of features bacteria can break before running out of things to break.
Nobody extrapolates from antibiotic resistance and the Lenski long-term evolution experiment to universal common ancestry. Nobody. You ask people for evidence of common ancestry, they're not going to bring those things up. They're going to bring up the things I mentioned earlier. So that bit is a straw man. Creationists, find me a single biologist saying that those things, the Lenski long-term evolution experiment, antibiotic resistance, find me one biologist saying that those things are the best evidence for universal common ancestry. I dare you, find one biologist. The best evidence for universal common ancestry, if you got to pick one, is the nested hierarchical pattern of genome similarity across all forms of cellular life. I've talked about this a ton in a lot of different contexts. That's the answer to the question. That's the best evidence. I'll again point out that what we're getting in this video is supposed to be the good version of creationism. This is the competent version of creationism. And again, it's literally Kent Hovind arguments based on deliberate misrepresentations.
Darwin didn't write a book called How Pre-Existing Organisms Break Themselves. He purported to explain how novel species came about from a single common ancestor. And at least as far as this is concerned, it was a failure. Darwin can't get very far by squandering pre-existing genetic information. Darwin's mechanism creates variation largely by throwing genetic information overboard and selecting for damaged or broken genes, blissfully unaware that it's marooning itself on an island of genetic fragility, making organisms, ironically, less able to adapt in the future, thus hindering larger scale changes from accumulating.
What we just saw there is nothing more than a straw man of evolution. It's just lies. There's no other way to put this. I can't find a way to be more generous about this. Whoever wrote this script is lying. We have many mechanisms that increase genetic complexity: gene duplication, neofunctionalization and subfunctionalization, gain-of-function mutations, whole genome duplications, de novo gene origination from non-protein coding regions, and even simple single nucleotide mutations that expand biochemical interactions without hindering existing ones. But here, we have evolution presented as the loss of genes and functions, without any mention of the mechanisms that work in the opposite direction. Are creationists not even aware of those mechanisms? Or are they lying when they omit them? For my money, this is basic enough that I think they're lying. Especially because, again, Long Story Short is affiliated with Discovery Institute, and I think they know better. I really think they probably know better. And we don't need to go any further. The rest of this video is more of the same without any additional claims or any additional information. So here are my big picture takeaways from the Long Story Short video that we just watched. First, all of the stuff about antibiotic resistance is wrong because both antibiotics and antibiotic resistance predate the clinical use of antibiotics. Once you understand that, the unserious arguments in this video fall apart, and that's not even mentioning the fact that they're completely ignoring a bunch of mechanisms of resistance. And then, all of the stuff about the Lenski long-term evolution experiment is wrong because they're lying about what actually happened in the CYT+ line. Those bacteria didn't lose the ability to regulate the CYT gene. that gene was duplicated into a new region in the genome with a different promoter expressed under different conditions. Still regulated. And big picture, none of that, antibiotic resistance, Lenski long-term evolution experiment, none of that is used as the best evidence for evolution. It just isn't. Creationists could learn that this was the case if they, 1, took 5 minutes to learn some basic evolution, and 2, had enough shame to not lie about it. But obviously that isn't the case, so here we are. So my big takeaway from this video, aside from the actual biology that I've tried to convey here, is that long story short is a liar. He's a bad faith actor. He lies about basic facts, and I don't mean like shading things on the margins. I mean straight up saying the opposite of what is true, and this video is proof of that. So thank you all for watching. Please remember to hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, leave a comment, share this video, and if you want to support what I'm doing here, consider becoming a channel member. Channel members get immediate access to my pre-recorded videos instead of having to wait for the public uploads. Thank you all again for watching. Don't get fooled.